I am really excited and grateful to have medical scientist Professor Jonathan Stone join us today. Professor Stone was director of the Bosch Institute, one of Australia's leading medical research institutes, for over 20 years. And he's going to talk to us today about the stress response, his theory of acquired resilience, and what we can do to live a healthier, happier, and longer life. Thank you, honestly, so much for joining us today. I'm very honoured and thrilled to be speaking to you. And I actually wanted to start by asking you about your theory of acquired resilience.
Yeah, so obviously it stems from my own work, but also in the material we've published, which are many database papers and a major review, we've attempted, because there are 10 of us on the paper, we've attempted to forge a new understanding of the response of the body to stress. And what I found was happening was I was piecing together slowly and then eventually joining the dots of a lot of early observations. Some of them came from traditional medicine, Indian medicine, Middle Eastern traditional medicine, on the health benefits of herbs. Loads of traditions out there. Because traditions are traditions and science is science. But once you start testing the proposition that curcumin reduces cardiovascular morbidity, and you test it and it seems to work, then suddenly it's moved into science.
Yeah.
And when I brought it all together, or we brought it all together, and it took 10 to 15 years, the theme that came out of it is that the stresses of the environment tend, if we are exposed to them, to increase our tissue resilience and reduce morbidity and delay mortality. Mm-hmm. So you less disease and you live longer. Yeah. And what are the stresses? So when you search the literature and say, what are the stresses that seem to have this effect? They include, well, the plant toxins. This was the one I found most intriguing to understand, but we eat plants, we've co-evolved with plants. And it turns out when you understand plants, and one of us in the team was a fine botanist, every plant is in competition with other plants and with herbivores to survive. Mm-hmm. And plants produce toxins, sometimes the very severe toxins, we can't go near them, some of the fungi, the toadstools, but every plant we eat produces some chemicals that have nothing to do with its own physiology or reproduction. They are designed to fend off predators, caterpillars, herbivores. And when we eat the plants, we experience these toxins, and those toxins upregulate pathways that make the proteins of our tissues resilient. And the classic one that we all have some sympathy and understanding for is the Mediterranean diet, which is rich in vegetables of various sorts, and is associated with low morbidity and delayed mortality. I think that's due, we think that's due to the toxins of the plants. In other words, and this took me a while to realize this, the reason why people don't do so well on the so-called Western diet of meat and carbohydrates is not that meat and carbohydrates are bad for you, it's that they're not toxic enough. And so it's the toxicity of the daily eating of what we, the vegetables and seeds and olives of the Mediterranean diet that creates that resilience. That's proved a very powerful analysis. Now, in addition to that, there are the radiations. There are long traditions of healthfulness of sunlight, healthfulness of ultraviolet, healthfulness of infrared. And of course, these are radiations that we experience every day, all generated by the sun. The literature on that, very large, very clear. In the right doses, they also increase tissue resilience, and apparently by the same pathways. A third thing, a stress that induces this response of low morbidity, resistance to disease, longer life, is intermittent hunger, which is the opposite of diet, not eating. Now, as with all these things, too much hunger will kill you. But intermittent hunger, which has been the experience of animals since they began to evolve, upregulates the same pathways. So there we have it. The plant toxins, intermittent hunger, the radiations from the sun. A fourth one is exercise. And not every animal, but virtually every animal has to be able to exercise to either to chase down prey or to escape a predator. And it turns out that creates hypoxia of the exercising muscles, and they release cytokines into the bloodstream, which upregulate the same pathways, which stabilize the proteins of cell membranes and also activate the mitochondria, the energy generating organelles of the cell. And there are a few others like heat. Now, severe heat's a burn and will kill you. But heat up to about 42 degrees will activate the same pathways. Indeed, some of the key proteins in these pathways, the heat shock proteins, were first recognized in heat shock models. So what we realized is that the stresses of everyday life, the stresses of the sunlight, the stresses of the chase or exercise, the stresses of hunger, the toxins found in food, create resilience, lower morbidity, extend mortality, and that this can become a tool of managing aging.
Oh,
So I think, we called it acquired resilience by analogy with acquired immunity, where in acquired immunity, experience of the pathogen upregulates the immune response. Here, experience of the stress upregulates the resilience response. Quite a powerful idea. We've formed a society now, which is still in its infancy. And yeah, so it's been an exciting few years.
Oh, it really is an exciting theory. And when you think about the diet, the Western diet, that's the one, when I read your paper, that's the one that kind of blew me away too, because you always say, oh, Kentucky Fried Chicken and all the cakes and lollies, they're so toxic to your body, but in fact, they're not toxic enough. And that sort of idea is just...
Yeah, it turns that bit of thinking about diet on its head. Yeah,
it does. It really does. And it does make a lot of sense, like with the exercise and upregulating. But when you say they all go through the same pathway, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that if you're doing all of them, exercise, intermittent hunger, that you're not adding up the effect, that it's just going through one pathway?
Yeah. So it's obviously dose related. And this is a part of the literature which needs, I think, more work. We've done specific experiments saying, all right, we can protect our experimental animals from this stress, from some disease with, say it's red light, and we can protect it with a plant toxin. If we put them together, no, the effects don't sum. Yeah. Yeah.
Right,
and
so
when you read into the people who've gone into the pathways, you know, the expression of this gene and that gene,
yep.
the same pathways turn up in whether it's resilience through toxins or resilience through hypoxia or resilience through whatever.
Yep. So are you saying that if you're eating all the plant toxins plus doing intermittent hunger, you may not be any better off than if you were just doing one of them, say? Like you're eating all the toxins, but you're not necessarily doing the intermittent
and
hunger.
if you're doing all 5 of them flat out, you're probably suffering more than you need to. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of good news, in fact, because that sort of really, because some human beings or bodies just can't stand hunger. I hate hunger so much, but I can eat my greens. I can eat salad.
Hunger is of all of those, hunger is the one that people seem to hate the most. So to give you an anecdote, back in the first part of this century, the last decade of the last century, there was a huge experiment set up in the United States called Biosphere 2. Mm-hmm. And it's worth reading about. But a number of universities, research institutions got together and they built an enclosed dome. It's in Tucson, Arizona. And their idea was to train teams for totally independent life, recycling all their waste and so on.
Okay.
And 8 people went into it, and they had to grow their own food. And between you and me, when you finally find it, they admitted they hated the work of growing the food.
Right.
They had to do it. It took about 35% of their time.
Yep.
And so they put themselves on a diet. I think it was 2,000 calories. And over the first 6 or 7 months of the 2-year period, they lost a bit of weight, and that leveled off, and the cholesterol went beautifully down, and all these indices of lifestyle physicians looked terrific. But they quarreled. And the team broke up. And so my interpretation of that, and it's really amateur psychology, is that our bodies have evolved to withstand intermittent hunger and to use it to increase our physical resilience, our tissue resilience, but our minds haven't reached that point yet, and maybe one day they will be. Our intellects and our personalities will become resilient. But pretty good with exercise. Lots of people really, really like it. And we can manage the sun, we can manage food toxins, but hunger, you're right. That was a bad one.
It does.
And there was another lovely anecdote when I think about it that came out of the Biosphere 2 experiment, because it was a huge dome. With glass, with those geodesic patterns, but lots of light, and they grew trees. And the trees grew beautifully in this dome, but without any experience of wind. And they got to a certain stage in their midlife, still fully strong, and their branches started to fall off. And the reason was their branches got heavier than the wood would stand. And another way of saying that is that in real life, trees use the stress of the wind and the pulling of the branch on the trunk to develop, and they've identified it, a highly tensile stress wood just at the right spot. So these trees grew up in the dome and then collapsed under their own weight.
Wow.
So the trees, plants too require stress in order, well, not require stress, they have evolved to use stress to create strength. So when you see a tree bent in the wind, because the wind's coming off the sea and it's chronically bent, it is in fact a very hard tree for the wind to blow over because it's grown so much stress wound. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's changed my
Yeah.
understanding.
That's incredible. That's an incredible analogy even for life, and
Yeah.
that probably talks to us about epigenetics, doesn't it? Because if you've got the genes for something, but then environmental stresses must have an effect on our genetics too, mustn't they? I mean, we do already know that.
Yeah. So when I read into the resilience and epigenetics, and you realize that the acquired resilience is a new field, and epigenetics is a developing field. I discovered this anecdote. People working on mice, these mice they were transgenic, and the transgene induced an Alzheimer-like changes in their brain.
Yep.
And they would exercise them, and the exercise slowed down the Alzheimer-like pathology.
Oh, wow.
Okay, but then somebody, and there are only one or two papers, they asked the question, what if we exercise the mother? Will that have slow down the pathology in her offspring? And the answer was yes. At least to one generation, the resilience of the mother passes on to the child. Whether it goes beyond one generation, I don't know. We don't know. I've seen no reports. Yeah.
Oh, isn't that fascinating? And you know what? They've done similar things with mice when it comes to obesity and passing on obesity through men, through the sperm. So they've sort of shown that if you've got an obese father, that trait of obesity now seems to be passed on to the future generations.
Yeah.
So you can even it seems that perhaps we can even pass on resilience.
At least a generation,
Yeah.
But that's not I suppose what you call the core genome. That's the epigenetic modification of it. And I still am working to understand how that reaches the fetus through the recombination process of the formation of the fertilized zygote. But empirically, it's there. Yeah.
And you talk about your theory being a good model for very healthy aging, but what about the younger generation? I would say that that's actually a really healthy model for bringing up children too, because you look at them now, they're like looking at their screens a lot, and they're not out there perhaps exercising. And when I think of the trees, that they need that stress to grow strong. What about our younger generation? They probably need some certain stressors too as they're growing up.
They certainly benefit. So, I mean, there are lots of stories about if it's an acquired thing that, you need to experience. So if you want to be immune from something, you have to experience the pathogen. Yeah. And that's what this mass vaccination program is, to deal with the pandemic.
Yep.
If you grow up without experienced pathogens, you end up vulnerable. In the same way, if you grow up without experiencing stress, then you will be more vulnerable, and you will suffer various morbidities sooner, and perhaps die earlier if those morbidities accumulate. So it's the same concept, but they're different things. The acquired immune response is really an attack response to destroy, march out the killer cells, properly armed to destroy the cells that have been virus infected. Yeah. The acquired resilience response is defensive. It's saying, well, whatever happens in that battlefield, we are going to produce what they call the protein chaperones, the heat shock proteins, which when they're expressed will keep protein structures, membranes of cells, together, and we are going to upregulate the energy producing mitochondria, and so that the tissue will be stronger. So these interventions will speed wound healing, but They won't stop the wound, but they'll speed it up. They'll relieve pain, but they won't stop the cause of pain. They'll relieve inflammation, but you've got to deal with the cause of the inflammation if you want to. Yeah. So it's a general resilience response induced by everyday stresses up to a certain level. And with any of these stresses, too much of it will kill you. That's a different response.
Yeah. The heat is very interesting too, because I know from going to skin clinics, they use radio frequency to heat the skin to about a 40-degree temperature, and that's very interesting that you said that can upregulate, and that's exactly what they do in skin clinics. They use RF to heat the skin. Yeah.
So the critical temperatures seems to be don't go beyond 42 or you'll just burn.
Okay.
But if you can lift it up just a few degrees, you get this heat shock protein response, which is on the whole strengthening of the tissue.
I honestly, I can't tell you what a thrill and an honour it is to speak to you and to just hear your thoughts, and it's incredible. And so I wanted to talk to you about alternative versus conventional medicine a little bit. Sure. So there are obviously those that are very much in the mindset of only using the clinically proven therapies that have gone through all the trials. But then there's, the naturopaths and the Chinese medicine practitioners and the herbal remedies, like the traditions, like you said. So where does tradition meet medicine? That's obviously the realm of medical scientists, I guess, you're taking. And so where...
Well, that's right. It's an easy question to answer. As soon as you set up a carefully controlled experiment, and then you can assess some intervention or some herb as either effective or not effective. And if it passes the effectiveness test, becomes part of the world of science. I mean, the people have said there are only two sorts of medicine, those that have been tested and those that haven't. And that's a problem when you're dealing with this sort of medicine, which combines traditions with a lot of rigorous peer-reviewed work. There are thousands and thousands of papers that converge on this theme now. Is what's the role of skepticism? And so in my view is that skepticism is a tool in science, but it is not the end. It's not a goal of science. It's a tool to sort the wheat from the chaff. And I'll just say this, you ignore the traditional medicines at the peril of not picking out their wisdom. And so it's the duty of scientists not to identify the weaknesses in those traditions, but to identify their strengths and to test them and see which ones pass the test.
Oh, I love that. That's fantastic. That's so fantastic. And you know what the really frightening thing is? I was doing a little bit of research into rainforests, and they say that I think 65% of all our pharmaceutical medicines come from rainforest ingredients, and yet only about 1% of all plants found in rainforests have been tested. So the question is then, begs to be asked, well, how many other fantastic ingredients are in that we don't know about yet?
So I'm not sure whether all plants produce these toxins, but a lot of them do. I'm not enough of a botanist to say all, but on the other hand, the ones that we human, Homo sapiens, are most likely to have evolved a response to are those we've been eating for generations. Right. So if there's some really exotic plant at the top of the canopy in a distant rainforest, we're unlikely to have evolved a response to it.
I understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that makes
Whereas the toxins of the grain crops, almost certainly we're going to have. But nobody has really explored that. There's a wide variety of these molecules. They have all sorts of names, carotenoids, and the names don't roll easily off my tongue, but most plants have developed some, and we just have to work out piece by piece which ones are going to help our health. In that big review, we reviewed lycopene, which gives its red color to tomatoes and watermelon, curcumin from turmeric, crocin from saffron, and there was a fourth one, that's resveratrol, which gives well, it grows in the skin of grapes, red grapes, and is thought to be the explanation of that, happy explanation of the French paradox, where the French eat pâté de foie gras and lots of lovely so-called unhealthful foods, and yet have quite low rates of cardiovascular disease. Yeah. So resveratrol, curcumin, crocin, lycopene were the four that we reviewed. There must be more. But how effective each one will be, I don't know. On the other hand, I'm very much in favor of preserving the biodiversity of rainforests.
Yes, that seems extremely...
But that's another question.
Well, when it comes to what we can do ourselves, I mean, I've got some herbs, on my shelf, and I've got turmeric. Is that the curcumin? Is that the
That's one of the four that we looked at, and the literature is very strong on curcumin.
Yeah. So if you're going to incorporate it into your daily diet, is that going to do anything? Like if I sprinkle a bit on, say, my dinner or something, what's sort of the dose that you would have to eat to make a difference to your health, do you think?
Yeah, so the dose-response relationships are another area that needs more work, but the ones that are tested in the literature are in the order of a couple of hundred milligrams typically, which is what you would get from a meal of, I don't think anybody eats turmeric by itself, but they'll chop it up and mix it up.
Yeah, so, curry or something.
Yeah. Some extraordinary results have been gained for saffron. These are clinically published, small clinical trials, but very well designed, crossover, double-blind, placebo-controlled, which show stabilization of central nervous system degeneration, something that mainstream medicine has found hard to do with tiny doses of 20 milligrams. And, I look at with incredulity, but I know the people who do them. I trust their integrity and their reports, and it's really quite extraordinary that you can get a very marked resilience response from low doses of plant toxins. Yeah.
So would you recommend us to start incorporating a pinch of saffron in our regular diet, say, because it's pretty easy to just put a little bit of, it's an expensive herb, but you can buy it in these little threads. And would you recommend sprinkling some on your dinner every night?
Yeah. So that's what I do. I actually take capsules because, it's just a routine. I don't cook very well and so on. So, but all the evidence doesn't matter whether it's sprinkled on your muesli in the morning or taken as a capsule. It produces this tissue stabilizing response, which, for example, stabilizes macular degeneration, which is that awful degeneration of the key macular zone of the retina, which afflicts the age-related macular degeneration. And mainstream medicine has come out with a number of interventions against this, but Saffron is quite remarkable. People often talk to me about it, and I said, don't walk away from the mainstream treatment. Use the saffron as an adjunct, and they tell me, and it's anecdotal, yep, I was able to delay my next injection for a few months. It's really stabilized. It doesn't cure it.
Yeah.
It won't make it go away. But for people facing progressive diseases like that, stabilization is a wonderful thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's definitely worth using, and because it's not going to hurt you at all. That's the point. Like these, like eating saffron is not going to hurt you.
In those doses, there are no side effects.
Yeah, that's great.
Keep going with it; it'll make you sick, but that's true of every just about anything.
Yeah. So when we talk about your GP and the medical profession and naturopaths and the alternative therapists, do you think there is a role in our society for alternative therapists like naturopaths? Do you think do you think that can fill a gap in our medical system?
I think that in an ideal world, the things that naturopaths do would be subjected to testing with an open mind and made part of mainstream medicine. That's not the way things work. In fact, the naturopath exists on the fringes of mainstream medicine. Many of the people who borrow or bring in ideas from the traditional medicines are scientifically trained, and they will put them through the clinical and scientific rigor needed to bring it into into mainstream science. There will still be the hope-based medicines where a sense of nature and being closer to nature will hope that this approach will have a miraculous effect. And at that point, I'm a skeptic. At that point, I'm a skeptic, along with other people. And I've seen people die from that, from having trusted too much. Yes, die too early anyway. Everybody dies, but die before they should, if they trust that. On the other hand, if it's not a life-killing thing, if it's a bit of arthritis in your wrist, well, try anything you want.
Yeah. I like previous advice that you've given me for articles where you've said always, like you actually did say that just a minute ago, always continue with your medical regime and use the therapies as adjunctives.
Yeah.
Can you think of any instances throughout your career where you have tested something where there's been skepticism about whether it would work or not, and it's come through good through trials, and you've been able to move that more into the conventional medicine side?
Also, the plant, for me, it's been the radiations, the red, particularly we've used red and infrared light. I read the prior work and was skeptical, and no, that's worked out. The plant toxins have worked out. I haven't worked on exercise, but many others have. Well, that's not quite true. I did a significant body of work with my team. Students made it work, in which instead of exercising animals, we made the muscles hypoxic with the tourniquet, and we were able to increase the resilience. And the test tissue for us was retina, the retina of the eye.
Okay.
It was quite remarkable that 5, 10, 15 minutes, 1, 2, or 3 bursts of 5 minutes hypoxia of these muscles. You mustn't string them together or you kill the tissue. But if you give them 2 or 3 bursts of hypoxia, that would, there's so much wrapped up in this, but that would prevent a model of degeneration of the retina. It's quite remarkable.
Wow.
And we were very influenced by a group in the late 1980s who were interested in heart attack and how, now by then it was realized that a heart attack is usually the blockage of a bit of the coronary artery tree.
Yep.
A bit of heart muscle becomes hypoxic, and of course the heart has to keep working. You get pain and so on. And they can be small, and angina, it comes and goes away, or it can be massive and just kill you. So these people were working with dogs. They made a little patch of the living dog heart hypoxic just by clipping an artery for a very short period, a few minutes. And at some point they realized that doing that changed the muscle and made it resistant to another burst of hypoxia. The muscle used the first experience of hypoxia to upregulate resistance to damage, and the infarcts that they created were much smaller if the muscle had experienced hypoxia before.
Oh, wow.
And very quickly they said, well, look, if that's true, then a human patient who's suffering angina pain, which is hypoxic pain of the heart muscle, should be resistant to heart attacks. I always assumed if you had angina and you got a heart attack, well, you were gone.
Yeah.
But the opposite's true. And when the studies were done, it turns out that people presenting with a major heart attack, some with and some without angina, the damage was much worse in the people who had not had a history of angina. Angina protects the heart. And in the same way, transient strokes of the brain protect the brain. So it was turning a lot of my assumptions on their head. And of course, I can't work on all those models in one lab. So we joined the dots on that to come up with this concept of stress-induced resilience.
How interesting. That's extremely interesting. You would just totally assume that someone who's experiencing little bursts of angina is going to be more unhealthy than someone who isn't experiencing any.
So just get being even more general, I've worked in scientific ideas for a long time.
Yeah.
And sometimes the most powerful new ones are really counterintuitive, like acquired resilience. But then when you can wrap your head around them and absorb the new understanding, suddenly things are explained. Why would trees growing without wind suddenly collapse? So why would angina protect you against a severe heart attack, and so on? Yeah.
Wow.
And then you know you're onto a good idea.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
It can take decades to get there, and it's not linear. And so I find, and I'm probably now going beyond the scope of what you wanted to talk about, but I find that granting bodies are so conservative they will not consider funding these ideas because, there's somebody working in the mainstream who's just about to connect a dot, and they're not interested in people who are discovering new dots, There's a dot to, two dots to be connected. Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Open up a really surprising, counterintuitive new field. So,
Yeah.
great discoveries are sometimes made in either where there are no resources required except intellectual understanding, or in block-funded institutes where you don't have to compete for the money. You're lucky enough to be assured of funds, at least for some time.
Yeah. Medical research must be one of those really tricky areas where you must have to really fight for money, because there's so many areas of research happening, and I guess so many illnesses to get on top of. Where do you start?
So it's anyhow, I struggled with it for 30, 40, 50 years. So now I'm comfortably retired. I can think about it and enjoy these ideas.
Well, this is the time now where you can write more papers, publish more papers, speak out more, possibly speak out more freely too, because now if you're independent, you can sort of more, let people know some of this stuff that you've learned.
Yeah, but you've still got to earn your place in the scientific literature. You can't.
Yes.
Well, I suppose you could start a blog, but that's not what I do. I still go to the traditional journals and write a paper that I think will convince the reviewers that, it's worth saying.
Yeah, definitely. I think whatever you say is worth listening to.
Thank you.
I have been so thrilled and honoured to be able to work with you and your team at the Bosch Institute, and the fantastic scientists there, Daniel Johnston.
Yeah. You take care.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Suvi. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.